watched, you described Pirisg as a kind of sacred text, something that is so abundant in the wisdom that it affords that you can essentially return to it, over and over again, and that it has a kind of motioning life to it, that it continues to gesture beyond itself constantly, right?
Yes.
In the way that symbols tend to do, constantly beyond, constantly beyond, constantly beyond, right? That it subsists in its beyondness to some degree. And it does that in that beautiful analogic way of tracing the journey with the journey, right?
Good. Well, very nice to meet you.
Likewise. I've been looking forward to this immensely.
Me too.
And now you're in DC, right?
I'm in Washington, DC. Yeah.
You're in DC. Okay. Yeah. And have you been hit with winter yet? It's just happened here.
Oh, it just happened. Really?
Oh, yeah. With in force.
Oh my. Usually you guys get a lot earlier than we do.
November is always a bit of a wild card. Sometimes fall lingers for a while, and sometimes winter just arrives. So this is the latter, and I actually quite like it. It's been it's arrived in style. We've got a huge deluge of snow, and
really,
I quite like it. I think it's fun. But people who drive regularly and who have driveways to shovel tend to disagree.
Yes, I know what you're saying. Well, we just got cold weather today. I guess what would it be in Celsius? It went down in the 20s in Fahrenheit. But I don't know what that would be in Celsius.
I'm not sure what that is too, but it's cold enough. Yeah.
Below zero.
Below zero. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So yeah, you can go ahead and record if you'd like to. I don't know if you started yet.
Yeah, I just started, but
Okay. Excellent.
Okay. So really nice to meet you, Christopher.
Yeah, likewise.
And I've so enjoyed like the other day, in fact, you had something on with you and John and Jordan and Guy.
Yeah, that was quite something. I don't exactly. That was Guy's ingenuity, but certainly everyone came, I think, ready to play, and it wasn't. I think even the intended sort of outcome was there was certainly an idea of it, but there was certainly a lot of improvisation and just presence, and that was it was really quite something. I mean, anytime you're invited to the table with a bunch of people who are smarter and wiser than you are, you try and make the most of it. So for me, it was
I wouldn't say that.
It was just a bit of it was a lovely experience and a very humbling one. Yeah, as I was talking to John about it afterwards, and there's something. Yeah, humility is what I keep coming back to. Certainly, when you get to be in dialogue with people who have such a breadth and depth of experience to bear, and who come from so many different disciplines too, which is also quite fascinating. It's I don't know. It's an experience certainly that academe never seemed to provide.
Yeah,
and it's something that feels altogether, well, having a public forum for it feels altogether new, of course. Having close familiars with whom you can do that kind of thing is common enough, certainly to me, but being able to do it in a public way is something very, very new.
Yeah, this is very interesting. You certainly held your own though, so.
Oh, well, thank you. I take that as quite the compliment. Thank you.
No, you were all very impressive. Yeah, I guess it was sort of, I guess that is what circling is. Wouldn't you say? Because I've looked at Guy's videos to some extent, and I know it's just coming up in the dialogue a lot. So I've kind of looked at what he's doing in California, and it seems like that was sort of the format.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I can't speak authoritatively on it because I've never done a proper circling session, but like you, I've gone and looked through the videos of it, you know, online, and tried to familiarize myself with it as a practice. And certainly now, having had the chance to talk to Guy about it directly, I think I think I have about as much of a sense of what it is without actually having done it as possible. So obviously there's that means that there's still a gulf of inexperience, because it would be difficult to know the presence of the thing without actually partaking of it properly. But my sense is, just based on what Guy and John and Jordan, what everyone was, the feedback is that it was something resembling circling, but with a particular valence to it. So yeah, it was a really wonderful experience. Yeah.
So did you feel, because I know that it seems like John's has become very enthusiastic about it. And one thing I like about, one of the reasons I'm drawn to John's work so much is the practice element of it. So do you feel like, you know, I mean, not actually, you know, like there were elements of it, let's just say, during that dialogue. Did you feel like that was something that that could add to the ecology of practices? And if so, how do you think?
Oh yeah, absolutely. But in a way that's kind of nascent, in a way that's undefined. And I think that there's, quite rightly, there's a bit of a there's a careful hesitancy, I think, when it comes to defining it. Because to define it, to tame it too quickly, because right now there's something untamed about it.
Right. I know.
And while it's untamed, it still has it has a certain dynamic quality. I can't wait to start converting all of this into Pirisg's language. But yeah, it has that sort of a certain dynamic quality, because it hasn't yet been arranged into any kind of stasis or formality. And so I think that while it still has a charge of the untamed, there's still a playfulness to it. Now, not to say there can't be a playfulness when formalized, but there's a certain playful, exploratory character to it. And I think I think this is right. I think this instinct is right. Everyone is quite hesitant to tame it because it hasn't yet revealed itself in its proper form. And so I think that exercise, you know, last week was, in a way, just trying to push the illuminated territory of the practice a little bit further, to try and to try and advance the coherence of what it is that's going on, but still without trying to necessarily nail it down. And that's a tricky.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean, but I love the word untamed for that. And it's just sort of like you're all going into it, you know, wanting, let's just say, the best quality to emerge, you know, in the dialogue.
Right.
You know,
that's right.
You know, in implementing the dialogue without, and it sort of seemed like it was directed in a way, but yet not. And there was a lot of, you know, there's a lot of very interesting things emerging, and, you know, just in the moment.
That's right. Yeah. No, I think that's well said. I think that's exactly it. I think there's a certain feeling of being possessed by the flow. It has this sort of fluvial quality.
Yes.
Right. And there's a feeling of being caught in its current, and not resisting the current, but also not trying to swim past the current, trying to simply stay in tandem, synchronized with the current. I think it's something like that, that's being possessed by a certain flow that is that you're partaking of, but that's actually fundamentally not reducible to your involvement or your participation. It's that simultaneous identity and disidentity with the play, with the game. And I think it's something like that. And that's also why it's humbling, because it's you're being, I think we said this in the actual dialogue, but you're sort of being spoken by it and being heard by it. But you feel that you're relinquishing some of your agency, but not all of it. Right. And that's where there's that tension between playing and being played.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And it's that careful straddling the kind of straddling that happens in the best of games and the best of flow states, for instance.
Best of flow states, and can really only happen as it happens, as it
That's
unfolds.
right. That's
no
right.
other place and no other time.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right. That's right. Exactly. You're being acted through as you act, and that's what. And having said, and I mean, I've had that experience before. It's sparing, which is what makes it so deeply valuable and so sacred, right? It's very sparing. But I have that experience every once in a while in the throes of intimate conversation, and there's really nothing quite like it. It's just it's an exhilarating experience, and it's and you can both climb to heights that you can't climb on your own because you're using one another's shoulders as a means of vaulting, and yet it's also imbued with a kind of a very measured humility at the same time. Anyway, it's quite a lovely thing, and so who knows where this goes. If something, I don't know quite what to do with this thought, but I had it, and so perhaps it's worth sharing. It occurred to me, I think it was actually in advance of that dialogue, but that dialogue, I think, firmed the thought and started to give it body a little bit more. That engaging in these kinds of discourses it's the first time for me where the identity of being a philosopher has struck me as an authentic moniker. And I don't quite know what that means, but that's something about engaging in this dialogic process has imbued the term with an authenticity. Speaking of myself, I'm not pronouncing upon anyone else, but speaking of myself, it's the first time where, even in a very sort of an uncredited or amateurish fashion, it's the first time that I feel perhaps that I can perhaps begin to, if only as a playful exercise, begin to wear that.
And that makes a lot of sense.
Not find it, I don't know, artificial or lofty or anything like that.
Yeah, I'm glad you used that word philosophy, because as I've been watching these dialogues, I've been thinking, what's going on here? And then I thought to myself something very similar to what you just said. I was thinking, this is philosophy in action. This is great. And now that you mention that, and now that I think about that, and you called it dialogos, it's probably what was going on, 2,500 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely it was. And I think that that's certainly the trail that, in preparation of his new series, I know that John's trying to sniff out that trail a little bit to try and retrace the steps of Socratic dialogos, but actually to revivify it and to rehabilitate it for as a means of being technologized for the present. And I use the term technologized, right, advisedly, because I think that bridges into Zen a little bit. But yes, and I know that that's something Jordan Hall is working on as well. But this idea of leveraging the practice of dialogos and integrating it with the other mechanisms we have at our disposal. I don't exactly know what that looks like, but I think that there seems to be fertile ground there, certainly worth exploring.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think that it's unavoidable, because if we were to say, and we can, I'm sure we'll talk about this when we talk about Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance, is if you are to avoid, this technology is here. And there is not really to avoid it, to be John Sutherland and just push it to the back.
That's right.
Isn't realistic, and to be like many people who think it's the be all and end all and just become consumed by it, or I guess another way of it being negative is the virtual exodus that John and you talk about, but to integrate it in the highest quality way, I think is what what's really important for us to be thinking about right now.
That's right, exactly. Now, since you've brought up the Sutherlands, and
Since I've opened the pages.
since you've opened the pages, let me use this as an
Mhm.
opportunity to sneak in, and because I really, I've been following. I haven't seen all of them yet, but I've certainly seen many of your exegesis videos on Zen. And the other motorcycle maintenance as you've proceeded chapter to chapter, which, by the way, is just such a fantastic for just our collective comprehension. It's such a beautiful pedagogical exercise that you've been undertaking, and it's the way you've been doing it as well, the level of resolution that you take, the particular approach you have, the cadence of the delivery, as well as what you're choosing to focus on. Like, it's all just incredibly, just beautifully done.
Thank you so
And
much.
I have to say, I'm particularly grateful. I'm grateful to you for doing this, and obviously I'm grateful to John, obviously, for pointing me in the direction of these videos of yours, because I read Zen. I think I first read Zen when I was 17 or 18, and then I read Lila a few years later, and they had a really profound influence on me, and stirred a lot of the interests that were at the time perhaps only inklings. And I hadn't thought about them, though, directly. I hadn't thought about them for years, even though I think namelessly they were always underfoot as I treaded whatever paths I treaded. But having this exposure to you and your videos has brought it's all come flooding back. And as I think you've said very rightly, it's an incredibly rich, both of them are incredibly rich volumes, and there's just no way that conceivably that I could have learned all there is to be learned from them, or related all there was to be related in them at the ages that I first read them. A fraction, certainly, just a fraction. So now, sort of leading up to this chat with you, I've been I've been listening to your videos, and I've been rereading selections from both books. I haven't yet had the opportunity to do it cover to cover yet, but I retained enough memory from the books that I could go back and still identify selections of it and remember roughly in what order they fell. And the experience of going back now with like 10 odd years of, 10 years of experience intervening has been an incredibly rich and just a meaningful experience unto itself. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you for being so kind. I mean, I'm really stumbling through it. I don't have any kind of background in philosophy, and I read them just a few years ago for the first time. And I'm really I'm doing it to get a handle on it myself. And so I could imagine redoing it again at some point. Do you know, I mean, kind of what you're saying about reading it at 17 and then reading it, I guess you're 30.
I'm 30 now.
Yeah. So a decade or so later.
Yeah.
And, just I wonder how that would be like. And I even look at some of it now and I think, well, maybe it could be, maybe there's a couple I even need to redo at this point. Some of them tend to be just so heavy. One thing I don't like that I've done is I think I read too much of the book and comment. I mean, because I love what he says so much. And I just, I think I could never, there's nothing I could say that could compare to this. And I just get so drawn and enchanted by the writing that I just use a lot of it. But I think in a way it's a detriment. I think in a way I'm using too much of the actual text and too little of my commentary, even though the text is so much better than anything I could ever say. So I'm a little concerned about that. And
okay.
I think the next episode I'm going to really cut back and see what happens.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I don't know what other feedback you may have received about that style or that technique. Certainly, I'm not bothered by it when I listen to your videos, and I find that your annotations on the text are are always insightful, and it augments the reading of the text itself. And there's something, I mean, you also just have a nice speaking voice. So,
thank you.
there's something about the combination of the text and the combination of your annotations on it, which I certainly find very, very enjoyable.
Well, thank you very much.
So anyway, but I understand your sort of appetite for,
it's just like trying
redrawing the board a little bit and experimenting and trying some new things. It keeps it fresh.
That keeping it fresh is what it's all about.
Of course.
Dynamic.
Now, exactly.
Yeah.
Now, I'm sure you've told the story to some other folks in these videos, but I don't think I've seen one yet that has the story. So I'd love to know just your first experience. It was very recently, I gather, right? You just said it was a few years ago.
I would say right when I got involved in all this stuff, which was about 2015, I started, I just happened across Jordan Peterson.
Right.
Because I was very interested in, I was interested actually knowing about Carl Jung, which I hope we can talk about that too, because I know that you are very, it's very much part of your interest in education is Carl Jung's work. So I just happened across Jordan Peterson, and at the same time, I just became interested in a variety of, because I'd been in a very, very different world before that. I'd been in the visual arts. And so all this stuff just kind of came to the surface, and Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance was part of it. So it's only been about 4 years since I first read it. But
so, so did you find that, like, how did sort of first, so you get the sort of the all of everything that was surfaced as a consequence of Peterson's rise to notoriety, I guess it touched a lot of people, and it sounds like it touched you as well. How did the emergence of that specifically wash Pirisg up to your shores, and then what was it that engaged you so much that you decided to then embark on this classroom?
Well, Peterson said something. It was in an interview. I mean, it's come up a lot, but it's very much part of the Harris Peterson debate. It's like, what is the nature of reality and what is the nature of truth? And it blew me away when he said it isn't subjects and objects.
Right.
And that it shifted my understanding of reality. And I think at the same time, other things like that were coming up for me. I mean, I was doing some work with I was doing a group with a mental health agency that had to do with spirituality. So I was getting into a lot of spiritual texts. In fact, the thing that led me to Peterson to begin with was Viktor Frankl, meaning and Jung and meaning, and he just came up. So so that understanding of reality as something that is dynamic, that is not absolutely fixed, and you come out of the womb and there's all the stuff and that's all there is to it.
Right.
That transformation in my mind, that it's actually always changing, always growing, ever dynamic, meaning different things all the time. And so it was a natural progression for me to get into, to understand, like I guess I just picked up Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance at the time, and I said, wow, this is it. This is exactly what I'm looking for. This is that paradigm shift that I've been experiencing. And at this point, I just, I guess that's really about all I can say about that, to answer your question. Sorry, that was a little long-winded.
No. That's okay. I tend to be very, very long-winded.
But wait, let me just say one more thing. And understanding, and this is why I'm so drawn to John and yours work, understanding that there is something happening right now that is making the utility of subject-object metaphysics untenable.
Right.
And that this different way of seeing things is the only way you can see things, because things have become so complicated.
Right.
And I know you use the word complicated instead of complex.
Complex,
on,
yes.
on purpose.
Yes, yes, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right. And so in tracing the motorcycle journey,
Mm-hmm.
do you find from the time that you started it to the time perhaps up to the present, do you find that I remember you in the conversation with John that I watched, you described Pirisg as a kind of sacred text, something
Mm-hmm.
that is so abundant
Mm-hmm.
in the wisdom that it affords that you can essentially return to it,
Mm-hmm.
over and over again, and that it has a kind of it has a kind of motioning life to it, that it continues to gesture beyond itself
Mm-hmm.
constantly, right?
Yes.
In the way that symbols tend to do, constantly beyond, constantly beyond, constantly beyond, right? That it subsists in its beyondness to some degree. And it does that in that beautiful analogic way of tracing the journey with the journey, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the topography of the mountains and the woods and the etc. So do you find that in tracing the journey over with your own,
Mm-hmm.
how do you find that your understanding of quality has evolved alongside it?
That's a great question. Thank you. I think in a lot of ways it goes back to when I was first trying to understand, because I became interested in Eastern philosophies when I was first beginning a spiritual journey, let's just say several years ago. And there's something about that immediate experience that is so liberating and seems so real, that the immediate experience, let's just say, of enlightenment, or what would John call it? Would he call it anagage? What do you think?
Anagage?
Yeah.
The ascendancy?
What do you think is, out of all the terms that John uses for, which are great terms, I love the fact that he's introducing all this useful vocabulary. But what do you think he would use for the term enlightenment in the Eastern sense?
That's a good question. Perhaps sate.
I think that's it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's what he's.
Yeah.
I think that's the word that he's used. So there's something about that, immediate experience of reality that that quality really lines up with. But when I first read it, and when he says the quality is Tao, I think my understanding of quality has changed, because there is an element of the Western side of it too.
Yeah.
That there is a progression rather than it just being in the moment experience, and that is the standard of enlightenment that we're going to use. Because we're Westerners, there is a progressive element,
right,
to, and that's more like the anagage.
Right.
That's more like going from darkness to lightness, let's just say.
Right.
It's really hard to describe what I mean, but I think that I saw it as more of a totally Eastern thing at the beginning, and now I see the incorporation of the totality of, let's just say, human enlightenment experience.
Right. No, I think that's very well said. It's a very, very, very difficult thing to wind vocabulary around and then tighten it. I love
that.
Place.
What you just said.
It's so difficult. It bucks any kind of purchase, right? It's constantly resisting, and that's its dynamic character, right? That it continually resists classification. But I know what you mean, and I think that perhaps that has something to do with the scalability of what we mean by quality relations. Scalability, I know, is something that Paul Vanderklay talks a lot about with reference to Christianity, with reference to the function of religious systems and the meta-narrative of religious systems, that they have to somehow be able to, that they are figured by relations that have to be able to adhere at different resolutions. And
could I ask you something?
of course.
Because I need to ask you now before, so I can understand. I'm a little confused by scalability and the notion of, you know, they say fractals, like Peugeot uses like a kind of, or, you know, everyone is using fractals and scalability. Could you
Right.
tell me the difference?
Sure. Well, okay. I mean, I know what a fractal is. I'm not incredibly familiar with the way that Jonathan Peugeot uses the term. So I'll have to qualify that. What I think they mean, so maybe I'll talk about scalability first.
Yeah, I think maybe I don't understand scalability.
Scalability.
Yeah.
So what I think scalability means, and I don't know if Paul would use these terms, but I'll try and approximate what I think he means, and then if he ever watches this, then I hope he'll correct me. But I think to be able to scale a meta-meaning system, I think means to be able to render it into the vocabulary of various sort of analogic levels.
Mm-hmm.
So to be able to analogize it to be able to analogize it within different levels of experience, and have those experiences be able to synchronize with similar patterns of intelligibility. Because I think that's broadly what analogies do, right? And certainly enacted analogies, which is obviously what we mean by symbols.
Yes, yes.
Are enacted analogies threaded by sequences of symbols. That to have something scalable means to be able to participate in it, to be able to partake of it at those different levels, those different modes of experience. So I'm trying to think of a way to give an instance of this, which would make it scalable if I could give an instance of it, right? Well, perhaps one way of thinking about the scalability of it is to think about is to think a little bit about ritual, is to think about how something can be ritually rendered in a way that we can partake of it with our identity, and also that it can become interrogated by more classical intellectual means, right? So for instance, to take something which I'm more familiar with, to take something like Christianity can be interrogated theologically and systematically. I mean, like theology is an incredibly systematic and rigorous and very analytical at times way of interrogating religious symbolism and narrative and myth. And on the other hand, simultaneously and I was going to say synchronistically, but that sounds too Jungian. That's not quite right. But it can also become dramatized in the way that we actually participate in the sacraments and the ceremonies, so that we can partake of it as a praxis with our identification, but we can also represent it in various kinds of models, and by means of representing it, further introject it and further subject it to a more analytical framework. So perhaps, as I'm saying this, I'm wondering now whether the scalability of a particular relation. So the scalability of a particular quality relation, because what is a system of wisdom if not a particular way of relating to quality, right?
Yes.
So if quality for Pirisg is sort of the monistic metaphysical prime, then a system of wisdom, a system that has us live by quality, frames our relation to quality, so that the particular system is a system of relation to quality. And that fundamental relation to quality translates into different classes of relationships. So I'm thinking of so if a system of relating to quality is scalable, perhaps that means something like it can be rendered in the vernacular of the romantic quality to someone like Sylvia and John, and it can be rendered and examined in a more classical system of quality. Maybe I'll give a little example of this. I was having a chat with John a few weeks ago, and this is just sort of a funny little anecdote, but I think there's something in this that bespeaks this dynamic in ways that I perhaps would like to unpack with you. It was probably about midway through October, and we were sitting and having dinner, and it was a beautiful, it was like the IDOS of autumn. It was this beautiful fall day, golden and bright and sunny, but it had that sort of wind that you associate with fall that seems to sort of herald, the coming winter,
yes.
that kind of thing. And like a lot of people, I have a real fondness for that season because it seems both melancholic and at the same time rousing.
Yes,
right.
It's
energizing.
Right. Okay.
It kind of fills you with a bit of this sort of remembrance that has sort of an ennui kind of character to it, but yet it also energizes you and seems to call you forth. Right. Anyway, I'm rhapsodizing about all of this to John, and I'm trying to capture this feeling, this paradoxical feeling of the foreboding that fall is pregnant with, and that sort of energizing stimulus that it provides. And I'm anyway, so I'm sort of waxing poetic about this with John. And as I'm doing this, he just looks at me and he says, well, of course, because if we don't prepare for winter, we die. And I laughed because there was just so characteristic of him to sort of be able to cut through the fog and pick up on exactly what I was trying to convey, and give a sort of make it in a sort of a Darwinian way, make it intelligible in a very classic way, without at all reducing the felt significance of that feeling and what it provokes and what is actionable about that feeling. Right. So I left, and I was thinking about it afterwards, and I thought, well, isn't that just sort of a quintessential dialogue between a romantic and a classical way of giving geometry to a quality relation with the world, right? That something, it is a response to a particular stimulus, right? I think in the way that Pirisg would say, there's something intrinsic about the response, and that intrinsic response can be poeticized romantically, and I mean romantically in the way that Pirisg uses it, not necessarily romantically in philosophical romanticism, but it can also be articulated into its component parts and understood for the classical imperative that it is. So I guess so something like that feeling that could be rendered into two different kinds of quality relationships.
That helps a lot.
That subsist at different scales. And I guess that's what I mean by the scalability, is that the feeling, the experience, the feeling of being possessed by a certain normative well, I wanted to use the word ghost. Maybe we'll get there. but the feeling of being ensouled by something,
Beautiful word.
And being bound into a particular relationship with the world, which is something like being bound into a particular relationship with yourself. Because I think in Pirisg's quality metaphysics, they are probably synonymous, and I think that's right. And I think incidentally, that's something that perhaps Jung would nod at and approve of. That the idea that the quality relation that you have with the world is the quality relation in the way that yourself expresses, right? It's a reflexive relation in addition to being a relation with the world. And that relation can be described in those possessively romantic terms, but it can also be understood. That relation can be scaled in such a way that it can be interrogated with that more classical analytic schematic. Sorry, that was a very, very meandering way of trying to. I stumbled my way through that, but something like that. No, it's
beautiful. I totally get it now, and it reminds me of a couple of other Pirisg things. For one thing, there was some analogy, and I wish I could. I'm not going to get this right, but it's something like, here's how you understand scalability in the metaphysics of quality. It's something like, in the computer, you have the digital, you have the ones and zeros, but the ones and zeros also make the novel, which is something that is going to, draw you in as a story in a very romantic way. And the computer has to be up, there has to be upkeep. So it's like all these different levels. I mean, I don't know if the upkeep is part of it, but it just reminded me of motorcycle maintenance. It's something like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
The novel itself is in digital form on the computer, but it has so many elements, but still at the same time, it's different ways information is present there. It's present digitally, it's present, romantically, it's present as a documentation, piece of documentation. So I think it's something like that.
That's right.
I'm not getting that right, but that's in Metaphysics Quality, how he's trying to explain this thing, and also how he was trying to explain, I believe, how something can exist at all four levels at the same time: the inorganic, the biological, the social, and the intellectual. So
that's right.
On the computer is everything all at once.
That's right. It's like it's sort of like conformity through a great chain, right? And the way that antiquity envisioned it, right? That there's a relation of affinity that synchronizes that synchronizes up the levels of being and down the levels of being, right? There's a certain there's an analogic conformity because the patterns of intelligibility are reproduced across the system, and that makes for an elegance or a quality relation, right? That there's a binding, that the quality, to me, I keep thinking of it in terms of adherence, that it has a certain, it's an adherent charge that binds, right? Binds perhaps uncoincidentally, right? The binding is what we mean by religio, right?
Yes.
At the center of religion, that there's the binding, and that quality is how we realize that boundedness at those different scales, right? That the affinity of the patterns of intelligibility are what are realized by quality relations, and that quality relations can be struck, and that attention to quality relations and attention to striking and realizing quality relations. And I use the term realizing deliberately because I think it harkens to some of the convergence between Pirisg's thinking and John's on relevance realization. But it is so quality, in the way I see it, is sort of the realizability of convergent intelligibility, right? It's how realizable those relations are, and that valuation is the exercise of attending to the realization, right? It's trying to strike it.
Yes, and that's very much like the last chapter, not the short dream, but the one before about Poincaré.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean,
which I saw that one. Yes.
Yeah, that was the one where I think I was reading too much, but you know,
I don't think so. I think it was
thank
great.
you. But these terms, and I noticed this a lot in I think they were in the one where all four of you were talking, but these terms, intelligibility, um, harmony, um, synchronous, you know, and coherence, and what was the one that's like coherence? Not adhesive, but you just
Did I say, was it convergence?
I think it's adherence.
Adherence. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, all these words sort of are fingers pointing to quality, into
Yes.
that relation. You say quality relation because quality is, you know, the dynamic quality represents the relationship.
Right.
You know, and I think that it's very interesting that that this is coming up so much, something that really describes the same thing. Could you just say, or let's just say scalability is
Yeah.
coming up so much in these dialogues,
Right.
you know?
Right. Right. Exactly. Exactly. It is. It is. And I think it's funny. So a minute ago, as I was talking, I said,
Mm-hmm.
I accidentally said the word synchronistically, and then I
Yeah,
tried to pull it back, but I'm thinking about it now
yeah.
again. And I'm going out on a bit of a limb
Mm-hmm.
here, but I think that that the realization of affinity in the patterns of intelligibility that are made, no, what am I trying to say? The Yeah, so the way that the affinity that we seem to strike with the world
Mm-hmm.
when we seem to espouse by identification shared patterns of intelligibility,
Yes.
I think something like that
Mm-hmm.
is very closely related to the Jungian synchronicity.
Yes. I know what I know exactly what you're saying because it arises that synchronicity is so interesting, isn't it?
It is, and it's yes,
But
it
it
is.
arises that which was meaningful now was in retrospect meaningful, and in such a way that you're creating, and this is what I think is like dynamic quality. As these patterns arise from what happened and what's happening now, and what, you know, along the spectrum of time, let's just say, this pattern arises all at once and it's suddenly intelligible in that instantaneous way that dynamic quality gives you,
That's
that
right.
harmony that Poincaré sees the right fact, that, you know, that relevance is realized, and it's so interesting.
That's right. That's
So
right. That's
that
right.
it does make sense.
That's right. That's right. And you connecting it to specifically to dynamic quality makes me think of I think it was a passage in Lila, although I can't be sure of it. I think it's Lila, where he sort of ruminates a little bit about dreams because he has a particularly vivid dream.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, he speculates that dreams have something to do with the attempt to integrate dynamic quality.
I think that
Um,
makes sense. Yeah.
and I think that too is that, and yeah, because the dynamic quality has this I'm tempted to say, use the word untamed again, right?
Yeah, I love it.
It
Yeah.
has that unintegrated
Mm-hmm.
quality to it. It's disruptive.
Yeah.
And that's why it makes sense that that would be a way of understanding the way that dreams are symbolically articulated. And I think that's a way of perhaps having Jung and Pirisg leaning into one
Mm-hmm.
another a little bit, because it's the unintegrated dynamic relation at any given scale of intelligibility that is what seems to protrude
Yes.
in the sort of the imago of the dreams, right?
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, yeah, so you saying you homing in on dynamic quality as a way of saying that, I think that's exactly right.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you should say that, you know, because in dream interpretation, in Jungian dream analysis, have you you must have had it done for you at some point?
I've not actually. No, I mean, I've read Jung quite a bit, and I'm an incredible enthusiast of him, but not an expert, I should say, an enthusiast. But no,
It's hard to be an
done
expert of
analysis.
on Jung.
Well, yeah. Yeah, exactly. And yeah, and Jung himself would have been the first to say he's not a Jungian, right? But no, I haven't actually done the analysis. Yeah.
Well, I had a course in psychodynamic psychotherapy, and that we had a short, and I've had Jungian analysis also. So one thing about it, and this is exactly what you're saying about the dynamic quality being that action being scalable in the dream, because what and I'm not an expert either, but what you do is you make the associations, you get the immediate association out of the way, like the obvious stuff. You know, you say, well, here's what it seems to be, and you get that out of the way, and then you start to explore all the possibilities, and the possibilities are really quite limitless, because it is sort of like, I hate to use the word Rorschach, but you know what I mean. It's not exactly, there's a combination of the images being meaningful in themselves because they have a representational quality, but there's also very dynamic quality to the images that you are going to project onto them, what is going on in your psyche, so that the dream becomes such a great tool for analysis on that regard. So there's a combination, and it's that relationship with, let's just say, the residue of the day experience, and what can be projected onto that to make that grow into the next level of understanding of the psyche or self, or however you want to articulate that.
Right. Oh, that's good. Yes.
And like I said, I'm no expert, but this is with my somewhat, you know, with a little bit of experience, not all that much, but that's which, but I think it's interesting because in terms of, you know, relating it back to dynamic quality, which happens, and then it needs to habituate, you know, become sort of a pattern, and then those patterns also are subject to dynamism, and then they habituate, and then and grow, and you know, and one thing I want to say about Jungian dream analysis is it's very typical not to just look at one dream. It's difficult to look at the sequence and see how they grow. And then sometimes there's sort of an anchor dream that you identify, you know, that where the archetypes, let's just say, that you're going to see emerge, kind of come up for the first time.
Right. That's right. That they begin to surface, and then you can, and then you have ability, and then the opportunity is afforded to actually to then reintegrate them, and so that then the static and the interplay of the static and dynamic has a certain recursive continuity.
Absolutely.
An escalating continuity, and then to have a quality relation, perhaps is in some sense to have a way of constantly and ritualizing the marriage between them in succession, to be reperspectivizing the dynamic within the static, because that's the way of properly. It's otherwise it's difficult to be able to get a purchase on it, right? Until it's integrated and then disrupted again.
Yes, it disrupted again.
That's
constantly disrupted.
That's right. But then the way of managing disruption, I think, is I think a lot of that is what is expressed in the motorcycle, right? Is that constantly being disrupted forces you to and to me, the sort of this static and dynamic dichotomy is in some sense maps on a little bit to what John talks about when he talks about the opponent process of meta accommodation and assimilation, right? That the tension of that opponent process and the resultant complexification is what makes a meaning system, a meta meaning system, actually viable, right? Is what makes it an adherent relationship, and that it's that opponent relationship that's present in the way that the narrator in Zen is able to cohere himself by identifying himself with the motorcycle, right? That he's not treated. That's precisely that he's not treating it subject to object. It's like his identity becomes the motorcycle, right? And there's a playfulness to his identification as the motorcycle, right? But that he uses the motorcycle as a means of it's like, this is going to sound a bit abstruse, but he becomes the logos of the motorcycle in a sense, right? He gathers himself into place within it, and he's able to play with his identity by the way that he collapses himself together with the technology. And there's something about that, I think, that and that's something that John and Sylvia, right, are unwilling to do, because it's like their sense of identification is not as mutable.
They are the old way,
they are the old way,
technology, and we want to go back to nature, and we just don't want anything to do with this.
That's right.
Yeah, where he's saying, there is you could say, and I like the way you use the word ritualistic, because I think that's exactly right when it comes to the maintenance of the motorcycle. There's a kind of a reverence and I forget the word, but it's like a prayer. You allow the motorcycle to tell you what is needed,
right?
And this is this is really interesting, because John and I talked about what is rationality in terms of Pirisg, and of course it's very similar to how John characterizes rationality, which is it is a means toward overcoming self-deception.
Right.
Is that right?
Yeah, I think so, and I think so. I think rationality in the sense that John means, and I think in the sense that Pirisg activates within the motorcycle is the deployment of attention.
Yes, it's attention, it's caring, and as you care, the motorcycle, you have a rational system, and you're tweaking the rational system, and then but then there's change, then there's another dimension. So it's constant back and forth between the action of rationality, what you need to do in the moment to make the motorcycle run, and the dynamism of that every time you do something, you are improving the quality of the system. You're adding quality to the system. And in that reverence, in that ritual, you and the motorcycle really are one. And it's probably very much like how John describes the flow state. There is no difference between you and the motorcycle.
That's right. I think that exactly. Which is why the motorcycle, I think, seems to tell him what it needs from him, right? He's cared by the motorcycle.
Yes.
Not simply caring for the motorcycle, right? And that's what exactly. And that's what I mean by the collapsing together of the identities. That's such that there becomes there's a continuity between he and the motorcycle. It's the transparency, what Apter and Polanyi talk about with the transparency, opacity shifting, right? And that's why he's able to symbolize. That's why he's able to symbolize a relationship with the motorcycle, because he's able to dissolve himself into it and then withdraw again from it. So phenomenologically, it's as though the motorcycle is tending, and he's simply the means of its tending. And exactly. But I think that because of the subject-object problem, the idea that one can be in a relation, the idea that one could be gathered by a relationship to something so technologized is something that's unavailable to John and Sylvia.
Yeah.
And certainly, to many of us.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not much better when it comes to relationships with technology. So, it makes me think of something. I watched this. A friend lent me a documentary recently about the typewriter, and I've never used a typewriter. It was called California Typewriter. It was quite good. It was quite interesting, and it's just a bunch of people who are typewriter aficionados, just sort of talking. There's sort of a little bit of talking about its history and that sort of thing. But what really interested me about it, almost enough to make me want to go out and get a typewriter, and then I realized that wasn't quite the point. But it was that somehow the tactility of the relation to the typewriter for a handful of artists, and I think Sam Shepard, the playwright, was one of them. Was a songwriter, and there were a few different people who were sort of talking about their craft and how their craft was actually somehow supported by the tactility of the experience of working with a typewriter.
Yeah.
And they described in so many words the resistance of the typewriter, the fact that the typewriter was disruptive, was actually conducive. It was a conductor of their creative process, because it introduced something that actually had to be tamed. It had to be integrated, and it had to be identified with. They had to have, Sam Shepard used it, actually, the analogy of a horse, riding a horse. And of course, there's only a quick hop, skip, and jump to motorcycle from there, right? That having to somehow, he analogized the process of having to tame and negotiate with a horse, and having to understand the horse, not just in a subject to its object, but having to embody the horse's concern as a way of managing and deepening a relationship with the horse, so that rider and horse can move as one. And that he felt that even though the typewriter, by contrast, is less informed, it's an inanimate object, right, lower on the great chain of being, as it were, there's still a continuity, there is still an analogic pattern that is also realizable within the typewriter as it is realizable within the horse, that there's the same process of negotiating a reciprocal relationship, and by the extension of identity, being able to embody the concern and the care of the typewriter.
That makes a lot of sense, and because
I just thought that was such a neat way.
It's great.
Yeah.
And because if you because when you use a typewriter back then, I mean this is the tail end of my experience with it, but because I think when I was a young person, they became electric, or they were more electric. But those old-fashioned typewriters, like what my mother used to have, each one has its own personality, as does a horse. So what you're talking about, negotiating that, that relationship.
Right.
How are you gonna, you need the horse to behave in a certain way, so you have to get to know the horse, and the horse has to get to know you. That's so true, because really those old typewriters had their own thing, their own personality. Sometimes they skip the K would be a little bit high or something.
Right.
Know.
That's right.
So that makes a lot of sense. And then another thing that makes me think of, and this is, sort of goes back to some of John's practices, is there's like a rhythm, to, like you said, the cadence of the typewriter. So as you're, yes, a musicality. There's sort of in that, and there's a satisfying, the hammer hits the paper, and it's really satisfying.
Right.
And so it's something like those rhythm practices that he talks about.
Right. The gumption, right?
The gumption.
That's right.
And there was one other thing I wanted to say, but I can't remember now. But
it'll come back. It'll come back in a moment. I know it will.
The stuckness.
yes, the stuckness and the gumption, yes.
The stuckness always transforms.
Exactly. And I found it interesting just now when you were talking about your own experience with the typewriter and the sort of the individual character each typewriter has. You used the word personality, which is such an interesting thing, right? It's such a telling metaphor that the typewriter, this inanimate thing, can be personated. It can be and personalized, and that has everything to do with the quality of the typewriter is a relationship, right?
Yes.
That it becomes part of the self because it is in relation, it is known in relation, and so then the patterns of the behavior of the typewriter, as our presence identifies with it, the patterns of the typewriter and its behavior and its feedback analogize into a personality because we have to cohere it in much the same way. It does become an extension of personality. And I think that it's a telling that we use these terms, we ascribe these attributes to inanimate things, but it's not at all a trivial attribution. It's a deeply meaningful attribution because I think it reveals, as our use of language so often does by its metaphors, it reveals something. It reveals the texture of that relationship very, very deeply, that we should make such an attribution, that we should find the self within the typewriter. And I think that's also what Pirisg is getting at with the motorcycle, that he finds himself within the motorcycle. He gathers himself by means of the motorcycle, and so it becomes something that he knows and knows through simultaneously.
And that beautiful.
Tension of that identification, that way, that means of identification with the motorcycle, somehow, that particular tension of knowing it and being known by it, which is a weird thing to say about an object.
But it is known by the mechanic, because the mechanic has, because the mechanic has made that, that personality owes so much to the mechanic.
Right.
And there's a lot in Zen about the individual personalities of motorcycles and how some
that's right.
So it is a co-creation. I think that's what I was going to say, is there is a co-creative quality to this relationship, the third, the relationship itself. It's not just, not, that third is where it all is.
Yes, exactly. And perhaps, I wonder, it's exactly right, the third entity. And I wonder, maybe that third entity, that is the relationship, that's neither of the two parties, but that
surpasses them.
That surpasses them. That is constitutive of their identity wholly, because that's another thing about, even if we just take person to person intersubjective relationships, you are, the way in which you are, the role you play opposite the other in the relationship constitutes you. It constitutes an entire identity, and the way that you are played and known opposite that person, just like the way you are played and known opposite the motorcycle as you tend to it, right? And so there is something about the way you are cast by it, that third entity, that is the relationship, is creative of both persons, that is creative of all entities. And perhaps that's a handy way of analogizing the nature of quality. It is as that third entity, that quality is the character of the relation that binds us into ourselves and into reality as such.
I think that makes a lot of sense, and it goes hand in hand with that analogy, my favorite analogy, which is the train. You've got the cutting edge that always dynamic. It's two-dimensional. You can't measure it, but it's the thing that makes everything go. It is.
That's right.
You know, I mean, like if you're talking about, you know, you as a person have all those boxcars and everything you've ever learned and your genetics and everything else, and then you know, in relation, that you've got that cutting edge of experience. So everything that is you, like you said, you're bringing to the table in that moment, in that, you know, moment to moment of experience, but at the same, but it's still all there. It's just, that is how, this is really, I'm going to try to, how am I going to say this? All that stuff that you're bringing with you interacts, is what is implied, or is what is it is, the quality is there, but this stuff is behind you, and it's in it, you know.
Right.
The influence, let's just say, that's it, the influence of everything you are and everything you've ever known, and your genetics, and maybe the collective unconscious in
Right.
that
Right.
moment, is all present in that moment of relationship.
That's right.
So
That's right.
I think that's another, you know, I think I'm pretty much repeating what you just said, but
No.
yeah.
But see, that's what we
Yeah.
do. I feel like trying to get some kind of purchase, some kind of theoretical purchase on quality is sort of like, it's sort of like circling.
Mhm.
I mean, in the
Yeah,
physical
a
sense.
different kind of circling. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah, circling around it, but not.
Although, yeah,
Yeah.
because it's so
Uh-huh.
analogically
Hmm.
apt. I mean both, I suppose. But in this instance, I mean, you know, walking around a structure of such
Hmm.
enormity that you can't see the top of it, that
Yeah.
its geometry is so multifaceted that
Right.
you can't actually envelop its entirety with any given perspective. So that you know, it's like going to some, I don't know, beautiful basilica in Europe or
Hmm.
something and taking a million photos of it, because you keep finding new angles,
Hmm.
and each particular vantage that you
Yeah,
have, that you determine to photograph, is valuable and beautiful in itself.
absolutely.
And I think that in some sense, perhaps that's what we're doing, is that
Hmm.
we're circling we're circling something monumental,
Uh-huh.
and we're trying to cooperatively gather
Yeah.
ourselves around it by photographing its various angles,
Hmm.
to try and aspire to panorama.
Hmm.
Um, though
Oh,
such a
that's
thing,
beautiful.
obviously,
Aspire to panorama. That's wonderful.
though such a thing is obviously not within our grasp, because it's precisely because it has its inexhaustible quality. But yeah,
Inexhaustible. Yeah, can be like
yeah,
the Tao. It you, the
like the
more you
Tao.
use it, like the more you use it, the more it delivers.
That's right.
Yes.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
That's right. Exactly. Exactly. Um, yeah, that's right. That's right. So this is all to say, no, any added, you know, any way of pushing the boundaries of the
Hmm.
perspective, and sometimes it's with a particular phrase, or sometimes it's with a
Hmm.
particular emphasis, or it's with a particular elocution. All of those things serve to deepen the gesture
Hmm.
that refers to quality,
Hmm.
right? To accentuate the gesture, because I think that's all we're doing in a sense. We're simply accentuating the gesture to the beyondness that
Yes.
quality is. Because that's all we can do, and that's
Uh-huh.
what we mean, I think, by these that's what these enacted analogies
Hmm.
do, is they are in a sense, they are artful
Yeah.
ways of gesturing our bodies in the direction of what is beyond us, right?
Yes.
um and that's why, I mean, that's literally why I think that the genuflecting we do with our
Yeah.
bodies, in so many traditions, is, I mean, it's that's precisely its
I think
function.
that's
That's the
absolutely
symbolic
right.
function,
Yes, I think that's absolutely right.
right? Is that we're trying to yeah, it's that aspiration. We're trying to extend ourselves, and that's why analogies are so much. I mean, we use analogies as though we're somehow I mean, they are approximations, but we're so dismissive of analogy as something that is as something that's sort of an instrument of language. But I mean, we render it in language, but it's an instrument of it's the way that the psyche opens itself. Yes. Right? It's that's what like these enacted analogies, these ritualized symbolic enactments are. Mm-hmm. Is it's the stretching forth mm-hmm. of the psychic posture as a way of exposing ourselves to evermore and evermore and evermore.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah. It's a tough thing to, yeah.
We keep pointing our fingers to that.
We keep pointing out, stretching.
So I'm curious, as you've worked with John, what is your sense of, especially because, not especially, but from your perspective personally, and potentially from the perspective of someone your age, what do you feel, how do you feel about the meaning crisis, and how bad is it? And what as you and John work on an antidote for the meaning crisis, are you hopeful, and what do you think could work at this point? And I know that you can't really say, well, what's going to work. It's going to have to be something more like enacted analogy, I guess. But
yeah.
Just as an attempt to just kind of get a handle on what's going on. What do you think?
Oh man,
yeah.
What a question. A good question. Just a tough one. I think. Well, my understanding of the meaning crisis this is such an obvious thing to say, but it's important to start with it. My understanding of the meaning crisis has matured alongside the work itself, and you would hope that would be true, but it still sometimes surprises to me that it's a project that I had cast out ahead of me and that I had to grow into as I worked through it. In many ways, I think I grew through the comprehension of such a thing, and I had a certain, when I first started it with John, I understood it theoretically, and I understood it, my relationship to it has I think has sort of consummated more and more and more through the work, because it wasn't so personal to me when to me it all started. And I mean, it had been personal to John for many years.
Yeah.
But in a sense, I understood it well enough to be able to engage intellectually with it. And I think perhaps there was a deeper resonance that had to dawn on me.
So would you say that you had a sense that this was, you didn't know how, or you didn't know what or how, but you had a sense that this was right and you had to go for it?
Yeah, I had a sense that it was right and I had to go for it. That's right. And I also just knew that there was, I knew enough to know that there was it's like that old adage. I knew enough to know that there was a great deal that I didn't know, and that I would have a lot, illumined for me if I strayed into this otherwise darkened territory. And I that's what I craved at first. And so my relationship with the meaning crisis has progressively personalized And I think I think it's personalized beyond the way that any project naturally personalizes, right? Because you become, I think if you invest so much time and energy, you become attached to
Yes.
the fruition of any project.
Absolutely.
But
Yeah.
this has articulated itself through me in a gradually intimating relationship. And I think that's because, well, I think that there was a certain amount of it that was probably true and present before the fact. And there's a certain amount of it that has become more true and present after the fact. And so, but I still feel that my grasp on the matter is still tightening. Every day I feel it tightening more and more and more and more. And so the process of working on it it's a pedagogical process for me. One thing that has been helpful to me, sorry, I'm stumbling through this question a little bit.
No, it's quite all right. I really wanted your personal perspective.
Thank you for being so patient with me.
Absolutely. That's what I really wanted to hear.
One thing that helped me a lot, because I sometimes get very overwhelmed by it. I get very overwhelmed by the scope of not just the crisis, but even just our work, just the argument. People come up to me sometimes. Recently I've gone with John to a few events, a few of his speaking events. People come up to me and they're like looking for the Coles notes, and they're struggling with the scope and the depth of the argument. And I try and reassure people, like, this overwhelms. I've been alongside him doing this for like several years now, and this still overwhelms me. So I think that the only way I've been able to sort of comport myself in any reliable and sustainable way in the face of such complexity and such evolving complexity, because that's the thing, right? It's like, it's not a static argument. Like every day it deepens and unfurls more and more and more and more, right? It's like my own comprehension sometimes feels analogously to me like trying to bottle water from an open fire hydrant. It's like, I feel like I can't get my hands around it. But that means that there's a certain forced humility that has to be disposed, else I just get crushed under it.
You've got to get out of you mean the ego trap?
Yeah.
Yeah. He's saying there's certain traps. There's the ego trap that you have to.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And I think, and you're right. And so you've put your finger on something here. I think one thing this has done for me, and for me, I say for me and not to me. Well, both, but ultimately I say for, because it's a virtuous thing. It's a positive thing, is that it has, it definitely dislodged me from egocentrism, because simply trying to wrap myself around the scope of the problem and trying to wrap myself around the exercise of articulating it demands from me something profoundly more than I am, egoically.
I think you're describing both the ego, like relinquishing the ego and the value trap. You have to be open. You have to be not only open as, the self needs to be open, but so does, so can you not hold on to old ways of thinking and values as you were looking at all this, you know, this combinatorially explosive amount of material.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
Like this can't be, you know, and I struggle with it. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
you know, John's quite John's a magnetic figure and person, and he's capacious, and that's a scary thing sometimes, because just the scope, the breadth and scope of information that has to be processed in order to theorize so comprehensively about something so complex is certainly beyond me. And yet I find myself in stride when I plunge myself into the complexity of the task and lose myself utterly within it. Such, because it's just not about me, right? And I mean, and John would say the same of himself. He would say, well, it's not about me either. And that's true, right? But you have to forfeit a lot of egocentric predilections in order for the task to have even a chance of being viable. And so the dissolution of myself into the project, at least periodically, is something that went for me from being from giving me a certain amount of angst to actually being quite liberating.
Isn't that interesting?
Yes. The moment I've had to realize this it's not like there was one moment and that was it. No, I have to go through this existential exercise actually very often. It's one of the things about working with John that's challenging, but that's ultimately edifying, is that I have to take, when I say take myself out of the equation, I don't mean the deeper, the broader Jungian sense of self, right? I just mean the sort of the nattering egoic, the nattering egoic identity that's held aloft, right? The idolatrous tendency that we have to understand ourselves as fixed semiotic entities, right?
Absolutely.
That's what I mean by setting that aside. It's there's a privation of idolatrous instinct that's very, very helpful, because you just can't do both at the same time. You cannot be precious about yourself and also give yourself utterly first to comprehension, and then to the exercise of elocution. And to me, the exercise is the same thing. Because
that makes sense.
By speaking and rendering intelligible, I learn it and am spoken by it. Right. That's the way that the logos of the project enfolds both the learning and the delivery of the product, right? It's all, I now understand it to be one process. I don't distinguish my own learning anymore from the exercise of producing out of it. To me,
that's
it
amazing.
is all, and that to me is the best way of figuring it as a quality relationship.
Absolutely.
It is a quality of being produced by, producing and being produced by.
Exactly.
And so as soon as I started to, those things twofold, right? The moment I started to understand that I could not and should not distinguish my own education and my own information, my own being informed, from the project of, like, the sedulous project of working on the products themselves, that I should not distinguish those two things because they were fundamentally one. And the moment I made that identity, connection, that all of a sudden was a better way of thinking about it, because then I wasn't worried about having to learn and render simultaneously. They were both part of one exercise.
Absolutely.
So that was a huge relief to me when I figured that out. It should have been obvious, but I guess it wasn't. And then the other thing was what I've just said, is that getting over myself in the process. And then, of course, in one of those wonderful cone paradoxes that are just always self-evidently true. Getting over yourself gains yourself.
Yes, that's exactly right. And it's liberation.
That's right.
Yes,
That's
and
right.
so everything you were striving for using your ego becomes available to you once you let it go.
That's right. And then it can be reintrojected. And
as you need it.
As you need it.
I mean, we
as you
need
need
these
it.
because that's the thing about Pirisg. And this is, I think, the Eastern-Western thing that I was talking about, is that you don't dispense with that entirely. You know, you don't lose yourself to the experience. You also have your boxcars, and you have the, you know, you have your education. We've got everything we've learned, and you know, that we find interesting, and we integrate that too as needed.
Right.
You know, it's not one or the other, and every now and then you have to be a totally rational, classical, you know, go use the knowledge from the Church of Reason, and you have,
that's right,
you know, an area where you have to do it, and you integrate, and it's a tool.
That's
it's
right.
Just,
that's right.
Just,
that's right.
It's
That's
just
right.
that the whole mistake that people have made, you know, that we're talking about here, is mistaking the tool for all of reality.
That's right.
You know,
that's right. It's a category mistake. It's a classic category mistake.
Yeah.
That's right. Mistaking the tool for right. Mistaking mistaking the probative implement for what it is searching.
Exactly. And I think what Pirisg, well, Alan Watts says this. He says you can't eat the menu, but Pirisg says but Pirisg says something very similar.
That's
I
right.
forget what it was, but he says almost the same thing.
That's right. That's right. I also like how that's invoked a little bit. Exactly that insight that you're describing is invoked a little bit by, there's a line, I think in Lila, where he says that it's a sort of a tongue-in-cheek line where Phaedra says, you know, that's why the pencil is mightier than the pen, right? Because it has this, it understands it understands the sort of the provisional, the contingent, the impermanence of its exercise. It understands that its job is to, and this is sort of also informs, you know, that difference of the credo and the religio that John talks about, that the purpose of the credo is sort of the criterion setting, right? What it does is it lays the field. It squares the field for play. It's the framing exercise. It's the cordoning off the territory in which we are then going to play and play off of.
Exactly.
And that's, you know, that's what the inframing device is for. It's not the end, it is the instrumentation of intelligibility.
Exactly, the instrumentation. And it's necessary because we're limited beings. You know, we are inherently limited, so we have to, you know, it's like, I guess it's a scale. Maybe it's a scale of our limitation. You know, it
is. It's right. You know, it's the scale again. Totally.
Because we've got, you know, whatever it's that, we've got day and night, and we have to sleep, and we've got 80. I mean, maybe, you know, with technology, we'll have 90 years on the planet, but that's it. You know, we have this limitation.
Yeah.
And so baked into our experience is limitation.
Totally. Exactly. And so then it becomes, and again, this is where sort of John's theoretical framework interacts with Pirisg's a little bit, that it becomes an exercise in economy. And so economy, I think, is part of what is implied by the quality relation, because if the quality subsists at many different scales, then the quality relation is about relating to the right scale of quality for any instance of action.
Yes, and it may be a very, very rational, you know, subject-object thing that is the highest quality choice at that moment.
That's right. That's right. Exactly. Yeah. So now I realize, even as I did not answer your question fully, and maybe that's okay, but I want to be.
We said we were going to meander, so that's good.
I want to be, but I remember you actually asked me about the meaning crisis itself and how bad I think it is.
And if you're positive, we can, you know, that this work that's going on here, that's so interesting and so, I think, fruitful. Do you think that this is going to be useful, and if so, how, and how, you know?
I think that this very recent, and this is me talking and not talking for John, which is, I think, is an important distinction to make. But I think for me, these recent forays into playful dialogos
Mm-hmm.
have inspired me with, I don't want to say inspired me with hope, because that sounds dramatic, and that's not quite what I mean, but have inspired me with a form and a model for what such an intervention could actually look like.
Mm-hmm.
An intervention that is available to us, right? That conforms to the availability heuristic, perhaps, as John might say. Because there's something so intrinsic to I mean, dialogue is available to us in that scalable way, in a way that many other praxes are not.
Mm-hmm.
Because of perhaps because of physical ability, or because of communal access, or because because of any number of factors. There's something. It is an abundant and inexhaustible resource, dialogue, and so to be able to use one another as there's an untapped enacted, there's an unenacted analogy laying in waiting in any given relationship.
Absolutely.
We are our
Beautiful.
own unaccessed resources, right? I and thou is a relation that we can strike without needing many other factors or
That's
resources
right.
at our disposal. So there's something so available about it, and there's something so, I mean, just being able to exact and leverage our intrinsic immediate sociability, using it as a body for symbolization, using the relational body of two persons or more interacting as a way of symbolizing this process.
Reclaiming it.
I think that to me is like, that's a good place to start. That's
Reclaiming
a really
it from
good,
the virtual exodus.
yeah, that's a really, really good place to start. That's a really good place to start. Because I don't know, like, when it comes to some of the broader strokes of the argument about this, I mean, certainly about the state of our wisdom institutions, the sort of the deracination of our relationship with religious practice, of the religious symbols that are available to us. I mean, for instance, Christendom in the West and the decline thereof, which, I mean, I don't want to speak about that flippantly. It's deeply important. But when it comes to treating that, I'm still working on understanding. I'm still working on understanding the diagnosis. Prognosticating is perhaps part of the diagnosis, and the prognosticating is something that the work entails at this particular juncture. But then the treatment is something that I think is in many ways still beyond me, and which is not to say that it's beyond John, but I still feel like I'm finding my feet in the. I'm still finding my feet in the sort of in the diagnostic portrait of the problem. And so then the treatment of the problem, the antidote, as you put it, is something that I'm very, very hesitant to speculate about, because there are forces and influences that are so prevailing and profound that possess me as they possess so many other people, that a part of me is remiss to start becoming too speculative, because I'm not yet certain. I mean, one question, for instance, and this question, John and I were reckoning with it, reckon with this question in what we're, the book we're working on right now, which was teased a little bit in the videos that I did with him, about whether or not that the symbolic framework of Christianity, for instance, can be rehabilitated for a sufficient number of people as to be a viable worldview ecology in the face of the meaning crisis. And that's not a question I feel very equipped to answer, because the question is, it's a I don't know. There are still dimensions to the meaning crisis that when aggregated into that sort of Gestalt perspective, appear insoluble to me, and it's very, very, very difficult to be certain of it's difficult to be certain about the fate of something that has had such a dynastic life and existence. And so sorry, this is a very
no, it's probably the toughest question we're pondering.
I'm just so afraid of being I'm so afraid of being overconfident in the face of such a mountainous task. And it's a good question. It's just one that it's just one that I struggle with. I'm still working myself through it. I'm still finding myself in the question. So in some ways, insofar as an antidote is concerned, I think perhaps there's certainly more than one way in, just as there is more than one language to speak. So I certainly do think that that's true. But I think one way in that's becoming more and more apparent to me is the way of dialogos, the way of philosophia as it once existed, without romanticizing the past too much, as it once existed, and adapting it properly and authentically in the way we dispose ourselves as beings. I mean, that's one thing, right there, that somehow how we conceive ourselves, how we conceive the self and what it is another way of begin, and that also maps onto the subject object, the problem of the subject object dichotomy, right? Because we alternate in we alternate in the self concept between the two, and we have difficulty marrying them. And of course, one way that we can marry them is by the conjoining function of symbolic relations, and that's obviously one way we can do that very powerfully. And that right now is what I'm most interested in, is if our maybe this is one way in here, if the quality, or let's return to Pirisg's language, if the quality or lack thereof of our relation, our agent arena ecology that's constitutive of the way that experience is realized and renewed, if that amounts to the way we conceive our process of relating, which is to say the way we cohere ourself around relations, that fundamentally needs to be certainly rehabilitated. And if that's not rehabilitated, it strikes me unlikely that much else can be. If we still conceive of ourselves in this very truncated, bifurcated manner, then it strikes me as unlikely that we will be able to consistently strike relations that have the capacity to symbolically realize a more ontological relation with the world and with our experience.
So maybe we need to make ourselves more, maybe we need to really cultivate our quality detection system.
Yeah. And exactly, that's a great way of saying it. And maybe that's one of the things that Dialogos can do.
I think so.
It can be a compass for it can be the Dialogos, and perhaps it's fitting that a compass is a circle. But it can be an orientation compass for the purpose of
orientation towards quality.
Yes.
And I think, and as Pirisg said, we do know it. We have the capacity to know what quality is. It's just clearing the way to connect with it.
That's right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Whew, good question, though. My goodness. I'm sorry.
No, it was beautiful. I loved it. So we're heading up to 2 hours.
Are we really? Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Well, we're going to have to do this again. I feel there's so much more to be said.
There's so much more to be said. It's these 2 books for me are, as Plato is for John, they're sacred texts because they're endless resources of, going back and finding wisdom and using where my boxcars are now to engage.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Well, Chris, I knew I would so enjoy talking to you. Your use of language is so beautiful.
Oh, thank you, Sutherland.
You're just one of the, it's wonderful to hear you speak.
Well, the
same is true. With words.
You're so kind. You're so kind.
No, I'm just taking my pre-intellectual awareness of the quality of speech and articulating it, turning it into a pattern, the static pattern of.
Well, you've been
of that observation.
That's well put. That's well put. You've been so generous, and thank you for that.
No, so have you, and I really appreciate it.
And it's been my pleasure. This has been such great fun, and as with the best conversations, it has surfaced all kinds of things that certainly could not have surfaced without it, without you, and with your particular kind of inquiry, which is just, you have a way with inquiry that's exacting while also being just incredibly I don't know, you somehow know how to sharpen the point on the end of the pencil just so that it writes just so, really, and I think that's clearly indicates that the attention to quality that you have intellectually is clearly manifest in practice. So I really mean that. And the way you've brought Pirisg into this conversation is like, it's just note perfect. I'm so grateful for it. And
thank you. I think he needs to be here, because I do think that.
Oh, you're right.
It's especially necessary for this time, because this is a time to switch our understanding of reality to something that is something along the lines of what we've been talking about. We just
Yes.
can't. It's too complicated. There are too many things in the world to look at them, to try to differentiate them as objects.
That's right.
We have to get to the underlying pattern and use that, I think.
That's right. And the stakes are high.
And the stakes are really high. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
exactly.
All right. So let's do this again maybe next month.
That would be great. I'd love that. Let's do it.
Okay. Thank you so much, Christopher. And
Thank
best
you.
of luck with your second book. I mean, it's so exciting you guys are doing that.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it's a labor of love. It truly is.
Because you've got a full-time job, you know. So
yes, although I've just started. I do, and that's very, very challenging.
Mm-hmm.
But I've just started to leave. I've taken a leave from work so that I can dedicate to work on the book, and also the book's sort of at the center of it. But I'm also just trying to dedicate myself wholesale a little bit more just to these conversations.
Doesn't it make sense?
Just having the time to steep in them, to steep in the thinking before and after is a luxury that circumstances hasn't afforded, and that it occurred to me that I needed to make time, because otherwise it would become less and less and less viable.
Well,
so I'm excited to now be able to focus.
Good. I'm glad you got the time because we need you here.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Okay, Christopher. So we will talk soon.
That sounds great. And take care in the meantime. And I'm going to continue following your series. I get excited whenever they come out.
24 is hard. I've been studying it for 2 weeks. It's an important chapter, and I don't want to, like I said, I don't want to, have 40 pages of quotes. I want to try to make it a little bit more, a little bit more dynamic.
You will.
But 24 is a really good chapter.
I can't wait.
It's like the stuff we're talking about today. So
yeah, I'll be following along eagerly.
Okay, Christopher, I will talk to you soon.
You bet. Thanks so much.
Thank you, and take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.